In 1911,
le messager européen, nous avons publié un dossier sur le crépuscule.
so we published a report about the dusk of Europe on U.S. campuses. And so at the time when we published this report, we were very concerned about the revisionism occurring with various curricula. And major American universities were already doing this at the time: Stanford, Berkeley, Duke, and Harvard. And this was required in order to recognize the demands of various minorities, apparently, said Daniel Semnor. And for this reason, an entire policy was implemented aimed at introducing, in terms of the recruitment of teachers, and in terms of assessing students' results, various considerations linked to race, gender, and sexual preference. One of these measures was particularly unsettling, said this writer, and it was in terms of school programs and the fact that the dead white European males were going to be kicked out of the curriculum. And these dead white American males were going to be replaced with contemporary texts whose sole value is ideological. And today, we are in 2021. 30 years have gone by since the publication of that article, and yet America has not walked that back. The United States have continued on that same course. In fact, the movement has been accelerated. Studies proliferate on the corpses of former humanities. And they quite virtuously replace, and with great impatience, the claims of minorities with secular principles of research. Gender and race now have a central role in universities, but also in corporations, in Hollywood, and also in the midst of very many media. Those who are politically correct are now called wokes. They are woke to all forms of discrimination, to all forms of injustice. And to the astonishment of European readers, the New York Times, which in the past was completely impartial, is today a woke newspaper. It is a U.S. Pravda, so to say, that has emerged 30 years after the fall of communism. And this is a reality that nobody could have predicted, not even Tocqueville. This is a great mystery that I myself cannot unravel. And that is why I am particularly pleased to welcome here today Joshua Mitchell, who is a professor of political theory at Georgetown University, as well as Janice Rogers-Brown, former judge for the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., and also a judge in California. And then we also have Yascha Mounk, who is replacing Bakary Sellers, and who has written The People Against Democracy. And I should remember that because that was a book that had a profound impact. And thanks to the discussion between our three participants, we will have a clear vision of what is happening. And so this is the question, both trite but also dizzying. It's a question that I've been asking myself: what the heck is going on? And so, what the heck is going on, Josh Mitchell?
Thank you and good morning. I think what's going on, well, there are problems on the right, and I suspect we'll hear some people talk about that, but I want to talk largely about the problems on the left. And I think the best term that we can use to understand what's happening is identity politics, which has produced a political crisis that is, in my view, deeper than politics. It's a crisis, and here I'm going to sound like a theologian, that is a crisis of and within Christianity. There are, in my view, going forward, only two choices. We can have a politics of competence where we build a world based on people's competences, and we need that desperately. Or we can have what I call the politics of innocence and transgression, where the only thing we're looking at is the status of others with respect to whether they are innocent or guilty. And this, I think, is the ghost of Christianity, and I'll explain that as I go on. On the right, I think there is impotence, complete impotence to understand what's happening. We have still the battle between economic liberals, libertarians as we call them in the United States, and cultural conservatives. But I think they have nothing to say to identity politics. They've been completely overwhelmed. They fall back on platitudes from the Reagan era, and it's frankly very sad to see. Economic liberals understand debt. Cultural conservatives understand the debt that we owe to our fathers. But what I'm suggesting to you is that there's another kind of debt because there's another kind of economy. And the left has picked up on this other kind of economy. It's the economy of guilt, the inability to discharge guilt that now haunts the West. So I'm suggesting there are really two economies. There's the everyday economy, which conservatives are quite good at, and then there's this spiritual economy. And if you look at the New Testament, you find plenty of distinctions between the two. So Judas is the treasurer for the apostles, and valuable oil is poured out onto Jesus' head, and he gets very upset. He says, think of what we could have done with this money. And Christ says, there's something else more important here. There's a deeper economy of guilt and transgression that I'm here to address. So in the Gospels, there's this understanding of these two economies. And I think on the left, you've got the fixation on a deeply distorted version of this spiritual economy. Many of us look, for example, with incredulity at AOC and other members of the left wing of the Democratic Party who will say things like, it doesn't matter if it costs $50 trillion to have a green, clean future. And the reason why it doesn't matter is because they're not paying attention to the financial economy. They're paying attention to the spiritual economy. They don't care how much money it costs. They're looking for spiritual purity. All this to say that this is not, as those on the right want to say, some version of progressivism, multiculturalism, or cultural Marxism. This is a terrible way to proceed. And the proof of this is what people are doing every day, both in America and in Europe. The term that's thrown about is virtue signaling, but it's not virtue signaling. Virtue is a Greek thing. What they're signaling is their innocence signaling. And we have to be clear, because when you speak of innocent signaling, then you know you're working within a biblical framework and not a Greek framework. So every day I drive into Washington and I see on people's front lawns signs like Black Lives Matter, or I go into Georgetown and I see signs on people's doors, this office is green. And what we need to think of this in terms of is the Hebrew Passover ritual, where death will pass over if you paint the innocent, some sign of innocence, the innocent blood of a lamb, on the lintel of your door. Instead of building a world together in competence, what we are doing is spending immense amount of energies around the world trying to signal our innocence. Corporations have done this. This is what we call woke corporations. They're desperate to signal that they are not guilty. So I've called this identity politics, and I want to be clear what I mean by this. Identity can have two different meanings. One, it means kind. So my grandfather came over from Lebanon, so my kind is half Lebanese and half Welsh and half German. And that's fine, I don't mind that usage, but it seems to me identity is actually something else now. It's also a specification of a relationship. It's a relationship between different kinds, one of whom is pure, many of whom are pure, and one of whom is stained. And for the time, the prime transgressor is the white heterosexual male. Hence, we have to purge the canonical texts of Western civilization, because that group is guilty. And I hope it goes without saying that I have no interest in defending the white heterosexual male. I have no interest whatsoever in defending racial politics of any sort. But somehow, for the moment, the prime transgressor, the one who needs to be scapegoated, is the white heterosexual male. Now, this will not go well, because once you purge one scapegoat, you have to find another one. And we already see the beginnings of the next scapegoat. In America, there's this meme called the Karen meme, which is basically attacking white women. But I don't think it will end there. I think the next group will be black heterosexual males. We could talk about that if you want a little bit later on. But it goes from one group to the next group. It has to do this. Transgression and innocence are theological categories. They're categories that come out of Christianity or out of the Bible, more largely. And to put the matter as succinctly as I can, I would have to return to Nietzsche, who in the 1880s saw very clearly, whatever you might think of Nietzsche, whatever the political consequences of Nietzsche were, he saw very clearly what the crisis of the West would be. In one prescient remark, he says, "It is the church and not its poison that offends us," by which he meant we modern Europeans and Americans, we don't believe in religion anymore, but we believe in all the things that religion gave us, equality, dignity of persons, etc., to which I would add the categories of transgression and innocence. And so Nietzsche thought that the West would be caught for several hundred years, not quite able to go back to its Christianity, not quite able to give it up. And what I'm telling you is that identity politics is exactly what Nietzsche predicted. That is to say, we have the category of transgression and innocence without the theological accoutrements, the theological architecture within which it once made sense. Now remember, and I'll end with this, remember the Christian claim is that Christ was the one sufficient scapegoat who took away all the sins of the world. It's a profound statement, because what it means is you can't look to another group and scapegoat another group, because your problem is so deep that only God himself could solve this problem. You can only put an end to group scapegoating, which I would say is universal throughout human history, if you have something like this Christian formulation where the scapegoat is divine. Well, that's theology, and we're not here to talk about that, but I'm trying to suggest to you that we're caught up in the aftermath of this great crisis of scapegoating. And so what the left offers you today is the following. You, Europeans and Americans, who have profound guilt about slavery, about colonialism, about 2 world wars, and about the Holocaust, guilt so grand that you can't sleep at night. The left says to you, come unto me. I will give you release from your guilt, and all you have to do is give up your nations, give up your families, give up your churches, give up your monuments. And tens of millions of Americans and Europeans are daily joining that church. And my suggestion is there's no political solution to this. There's only, dare I say it, some reformation, return to a Christian understanding. Because if we don't return to the Christian understanding, what's going to happen, and we're seeing this already, is that we will adopt the Nietzschean categories. Because what Nietzsche wanted to do is get rid of all the accoutrements of Christianity, including stain, transgression, and guilt. Get rid of them all and return to what I would call an aristocracy of cruelty, where the only categories left are strength and weakness. Now, I have some comfort still, then, that the left is at least using Christian categories of innocence and transgression. I will be supremely frightened when we give up on those categories altogether. Thank you.
So we've just heard a brilliant presentation.
Now, this was quite extraordinary. I want to do 2 comments, please. It seems to me that among what we heard about the more woke, guilt is postered, and it goes together with a feeling of superiority. If we are awake to all the discriminations and to all the injustice, is because the others are not, and it's particularly because the past is not. The past is then a cold one, and it makes appear all the gaps. The deconstruction is acting this way. Past is not recourse, is pushes away, which makes the present satisfied and coy. And the young and woke are indeed kind of uppity, and it's unpleasant. I add also another issue that perhaps we can discuss. Why should we have that in the Western world, the scapegoat would be the Western world itself? How do you tackle us against European culture, which is the founder of the Western world? Then again, I believe that this phenomenon is extraordinarily mysterious. But I now want to pass the floor to Janice Rogers-Brown, which is a former judge of the Supreme Court of California, as I said earlier.
And thank you. I am not an academic or a philosopher. I'm really, I think, here to offer a perspective that is really the perspective of the ordinary citizen and the ordinary American. And I respond strongly to Elaine's question of what in the world happened, because it seems like it happened very suddenly. I don't think it happened suddenly. I think it's like termites. It was moving underground for a very long time, and we just didn't realize it until the house fell down. But let me start with the thought of Samuel Coleridge, who says, and I'm paraphrasing, everything depends on philosophy. And such as is the spirit of the times, as will be the fashion, the legislation, even the religion of a particular era. And I think there is some truth to that. But what I love is, because Coleridge was also a poet, and the way he says it is, he says, men respond to those philosophies, even if, like bats at twilight, they can only feel its reflections and refractions. And so I think that part of what's happening feels like that. So I want to start with what Leszek Kolakowski says was the single most famous sentence ever written in the Western Hemisphere. And it's this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, I think, was something that the founders in America actually believed. They believed that that was true. And that has, as Josh says, a theological connotation to it. C.S. Lewis says, you have to have a belief in an objective standard in order to have any obedience, which is not slavery, right? Or any rule, which is not tyranny. So what the founders were articulating there was the idea that is universal, that applied to all human beings at all times, and it was the basis of self-government. It said, President Coolidge, in a wonderful speech in 1926, the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, said there's something about the Declaration that's extremely restful. He says, if all men are created equal, that's final. If they're endowed with unalienable rights, that's final. If just government obtains its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, that's final. So he says, if you want to object to that, no advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. He says, if anyone wants to deny their truth and their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward a time when there was not equality, not rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary, right? So he says that in 1926. But in 2020, we have an academy that would deny that entirely, that would reject that root and branch, and would say, and it's very curious because I think this too is at the root of what we're looking at wokeness. This idea, Richard Rorty says it better than anybody that I've come across, and he wrote a book in late 90s. He said, truth is nothing but a story we will all come to accept together. A progressive story in which inequalities of race, sex, and sexuality are being steadily ameliorated. He goes on to say, positions articulated by opponents of that narrative are false by definition, false from the outset, known to be false before they are even examined. It is well within the value, he says, of academia devoted to the truth. Notice he's just said truth is only something we tell ourselves. Devoted to the truth, to silence those views. He says intellectuals are supposed to be aware of and speak to issues of social justice. The true narrative, therefore, must have the ex ante power to silence the false. And so, since this truth is entirely subjective, the narrative enforcer can't apply to any higher law, right? So the only way to establish correctness is dependent on coerced consensus. The polity must be continually policed to ensure conformity. So thus, political correctness, which is what flows from this, morphs into censorship or cancel culture, so that people are not allowed to express any view that contradicts the reigning orthodoxy. And if speech opposes that preferred narrative, we are told it is itself an act of violence. So speech is violence. And responding to such speech with actual violence is an act of self-defense. And I think this is at the core of what is happening to us. Because if you believe that, and I have heard that defended by professors in the academy, but if you believe that, then America's view about free speech and why freedom of speech is important is America becomes transformed from a place where speech is privileged as a way to control violence, and it's turned into a place where violence controls speech, right? I mean, it's the exact opposite of what it is we thought we were creating with the founding of America, and what it is that we thought we were all agreed that we should defend. But it turns out that for some, these principles were merely instrumental and not universals that would always stand us in good stead. So I guess when I began to see what was happening in 2020 with the erasure of history, with riots and fire and places being destroyed, and I compared that to what it seemed to mimic, which was the actual civil rights movement. This seemed astonishing to me because it seemed to appropriate the moral authority of something that we could all recognize, which is the wound of slavery and discrimination and the difficulties that Black people in America have had. But it appropriated it in a way that sought to undermine everything that I think the actual civil rights movement had tried to make real. So the difference between saying, as Martin Luther King did, we're here to cash the promissory note that was written when the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution came into being, because we want full participation in this society. As citizens who have not only all the rights, but all the responsibilities and obligations of being citizens of this country. That was turned on its head by people who said, this country is so irredeemably, racist and horrid and vile that there is no reason to try to preserve any of its principles. What we need to do is burn it to the ground and start over. As someone who is a descendant of slaves and is old enough to have experienced most of the inequality and discrimination that has happened in America, I thought I needed to say there is a different perspective. There is reason to think that the founders may have gotten it right. They may not have been able to bring all that to pass at the time that they wrote those words, but the words and the ideas, those are right. They, I think, capture the real wonder and greatness of what the West has done, which is to privilege tolerance and freedom and individuals and private space. And there is a theological aspect to this, as Madison says early on. The obligation to God is prior to civil society. And it's out of that comes this idea of the separation between church and state, limited government, room for human beings to be human beings without people telling them how to live their lives and what to think. So I think that those are the rare virtues of the West. I believe that they are entitled to allegiance and devotion and not to derision and disrespect. And so I feel that those are worthy of defense, and I want to defend them. We can talk about how and why, but.
Oui, nous pouvons tous remercier.
Yes, indeed. We can all thank Janice Rogers Brown for her speech that are very courageous. It seems to me that violence that she's just mentioned is revealing one of the traits the most bizarre of contemporary ideology that we could call the victimization of lies. The more you have rights, the most equality is progressing, and the more certain are denouncing the ferocity of this domination. And this denunciation is nurturing intolerance and cancel culture. And it seems to me that here is where we stand today, a sort of Beauvairism in ideological polity. Beauvairism is to conceive yourself other than you are in the world other than you are. And this Beauvairism seems to me is wild today. And I'm extremely happy to pass the floor to Mounk. Thanks a lot, Alain. I believe that in France you have a lot of politologists, sociologists, and I'm being told that you have also tautologists, people that are fans of all. So finding this spontaneous order, I'm going to believe I'm an allolog, tautologue, and perhaps I can become worse. But thank God, this theme is one that I've thought a lot. So I'm not assuming that I'm a tautologist, but I will be a little more disorganized, and I will move to English.
So I think there's two questions on the table that we're trying to grapple with here. One is, what is the nature of wokeness or identity politics? What is actually at the heart of it? How can we understand what it is that we're dealing with? And the other is the question that Alain put of why is it happening? And I'm going to try very briefly to touch on both of those questions. There's a big debate at the moment about whether or not the roots of a certain kind of wokeness are Marxist or not. And I think that's actually a very complicated question. I think in certain complicated ways they are, in many important ways they are not. But I think it's actually to ask the less important question, because the most important thing is not about the intellectual history. It is about the core belief that connects a pretty disparate set of propositions in the field of race, gender, religion, and many other areas. And there I think that there's a certain structural similarity which is worth bringing out. So the core proposition of Marxism is that the world is essentially to be understood as a class struggle, and that the best we can hope for in the world is not for some kind of reconciliation, but rather for the oppressed classes to win a permanent victory over the oppressor classes. And that is what a good Marxist, like my grandparents, would have fought for, right? I think one way of understanding a lot of the worldview that we're talking about today is as taking some of the same schema, not exactly the same schema, but a similar schema, and putting various identity categories in the place of where class used to stand. So that gives you a worldview in which you say that really what's going on today, but what's been going on all through history, now we've finally become enlightened, ironically enough to see this, is that we've had this giant battle between oppressing identities and oppressed identities. And the best we can hope for is not some kind of reconciliation, is not to build what is the topic of my next book and the thing that I most care about, a liberal democracy in which we are able to grant to all members of different identity groups true equality, to grant to members of all different identity groups the ability to stay within their own group or reach out beyond it so that they're no longer defined by the group if they so choose. It is not a society that goes towards reconciliation because it manages to get rid of many of these injustices. No, it is, similarly to the old model, a society in which the oppressed groups triumph over the oppressor groups in a continuation of a conflict in which finally the downtrodden have managed to win. And I think a lot of the conflictual nature, a lot of the zero-sum nature, a lot of what's ugliest in this moment is explained in a strange way by that fundamental pessimism, by that idea that the best we can hope for is not a resolution of conflict. There will always be some conflict, but it is not a compromise with which everybody can be reasonably happy. It is simply an inversion of the old power structures in which the oppressed manage to subdue the former oppressors. That, I think, helps to explain a lot of the sort of cultural flavor of this moment, and even perhaps a lot of the nastiness on Twitter and so on. So that's my best attempt at getting to what I see as the beating heart of an ideology that then takes many, many different forms. I think the question that Alain put about the causes of this moment is actually more complicated. I think that there's at least 3 or 4, and I'm very briefly going to go through them. The first is the rise of the internet and of social media. That's sort of the obvious one. That for a long time, you had a media structure in which you had gatekeepers that could keep out some of the crazier stuff, but also genuinely marginalized some of the voices that it is good we're now hearing from. But what all of that did is that it created some form of unity of discourse, right? You just didn't have a technological capacity to speak to every niche of experience, every niche of identity, every niche of what you value. And what you have today is an ability of people to find those they think of as like-minded and radicalize each other. What's happening on the right and the left, what's happening even on many issues that aren't straightforwardly political, from Catholic religious reactionaries in the United States to vegans, to people who really love a video game and will gang up on anybody who criticizes it in any way, right? And that, I think, has helped to put these questions of identity at the forefront and to make people, to push people towards doubling down on their own group rather than seeking those social connections. The second thing, undoubtedly, that has helped wokeism, if you want to call it that, or identity politics, take over a lot of the elite institutions in the United States is a counter-reaction against the rise of far-right extremism. So a lot of what has taken this on campus from a few departments to the ruling ideology of Harvard and Princeton and Yale, a lot of what has allowed it to conquer the foundations in the United States within a matter of a couple of years, and a lot of what makes it hard even for business to try and keep it outside is the election of Donald Trump and the genuine horror that, and understandable and righteous horror that has inspired in many people. The moment somebody who, for good reason, is considered loathsome, attacks a position, it becomes impossible to criticize it from within the left in the United States. That is a real problem with public discourse in America, but it helps to explain why these things become so hard to criticize. And you see that polarization on virtually every issue in the United States. Critical race theory, which has real problems as a way of trying to understand the very complicated and tragic history of race in America, becomes impossible for professors at the biggest campuses in the country to criticize the moment Fox News goes on about it every day. That doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to criticize what's worth criticizing about it, but it helps to explain the dynamic which has allowed this stuff to take over quite so quickly. But I think it's also important to be self-critical for a moment. And so I'm going to be speaking as something that everybody always claims not to be, which is more or less at this point a member of the American elite. And I think that there's two big failures of the American elite that has allowed wokeism to take over in the way it has over the last years. The first is a failure to live up to our own principles and a failure to serve people well, a delegitimation that comes from what political scientists would call a lack of output legitimacy. The fact that people look at what used to be the mainstream and say there's many things wrong with it. There are many things that aren't well thought through. There are many things that we have reason to distrust, and often we are actually being misled straightforwardly on important issues. And so why should I trust any of that? That explains the rush both to the extreme right, but also to the extreme left. And then there's something that I think all of us in this room, many of whom are genuine philosophical liberals, should reflect on. And that is our unwillingness and inability to fight for these values at the moment when the fight was necessary. The most striking thing to me, looking, for example, at the people I went to university with in the United States, and even some of my former professors, is that people who taught me in a very subtle way the texts of Alexis de Tocqueville, the texts of many other people who I would consider foundational in the broadest sense of the liberal philosophical canon, to actually stand by those ideals once they got pushback on them, to actually defend the ideals that they taught me and that I came to believe in part because of the subtle exposition they gave to me. But when the rubber hit the road, they and so many other parts of the American elite just flipped in their beliefs. We're not willing to defend it. And some of that is genuine fear for their livelihood. Some of them is having to put kids through college or having to pay a mortgage. Some of that is the kind of cowardice you have seen at every moment of witch hunt in human history, and we are at a moment of witch hunt in the United States today, without a doubt. But part of it is clearly a weakening of ideological commitment. Part of it is that even the people who have, broadly speaking, beliefs I share, don't seem to be as attached to it, don't seem to understand its importance as vividly as I would have hoped. Now, in the same way in which the rise of authoritarian populism has actually helped in some ways to rekindle a belief in the importance of democracy, because we are suddenly seeing what it means when democracy is threatened, I hope that the events of the last years and probably the events of the next years is going to rekindle a bit of a renaissance of philosophical liberalism in the United States, as people see what it means in their own organizations, in their own schools, in their children's schools, in their businesses, when you throw key elements like freedom of speech and so on overboard. I hope that that will lead to a rekindling of liberal values. But I think if the fight against the most dangerous aspects of this ideology is going to succeed, the first step has to be that those who believe in the basic principles of liberal democracy actually remember why those principles are so important and regain the courage to fight for them. Thank you.
Now, in the wake of what Yascha has just said, I'd like to throw out a question to the three speakers, if time permitting. Now, reference was made to the wokeism. Mention has been made of that. Here's my question. According to them, is it a fad, a faddish fever, or is it anchored in the long term? Something that's written in to the long term and might creep its way into the way our institutions are henceforth structured. Can we see any riposte in our universities or in the press? Pari Weiss was supposed to be with us. She couldn't come. That's a shame. Pari Weiss is the journalist you may remember at the New York Times who left discouraged by sectarianism that was holding sway and by distrust, or even I go so far as to say as harassment that she was a victim to, in particular because of the role of the Jewish question plays in her own subjectivity. You need to remember that Jews today, of course we all know that, are no longer a minority. Well, there is the tyranny of the minority, possibly, but the Jews have gone into the bad camp, if you will, thanks to Israel. They've come into the camp of the oppressors, the supremacy people, if you will. I mean, this is a bread and butter reality, and I think you really need to live under a rock not to see it. You need to have your head in the sand, really, because anti-Semitism is a component of Black Lives Matter. So this is a worrying landscape, I would say. And so, which leads me to my question, where are people battling against this trend that we're seeing emerge? I think we've had all our speakers speak, and I think you probably ought to stop because your tummies are no doubt rumbling. Who'd like to answer?
You can answer that?
Well, I said at the outset, not going to work. I said at the outset that we really have two choices in front of us. One is the politics of competence, and the other is the politics of innocence and transgression. And in my field, history of political thought, it's very clear, both at Georgetown and in every other place around the country, that the canon, the group of people who wrote the canon are under fire because they're members of the prime transgressors. Even NASA, all of our institutions are penetrated by this. So the Apollo male god, we now have the Artemis missions coming up with the view of spending billions of dollars to level the playing field so that a woman can be the first one, the next one on the moon. Every one of our institutions is moving in this direction. And if I can just explain why by talking about Marxism again, just for a second. So the question was, why didn't Marxism make its way into America? Conservatives will talk about the long, slow march through the institutions, and they'll cite Gramsci, and this is sort of standard fare now. And so identity politics is the next wave of this Gramscian plan of the long, slow march through the institutions. Well, Marxism didn't work in America because the central category for Marxism was class. Tocqueville said this. It's in the author's introduction, 2/3 of the way through of Democracy in America. Go check it out. He's the first one to write about it. So it wouldn't, the categories, the cultural categories wouldn't fit in America, which is why Marxism would require a long, slow march through the institutions. But as we all know, identity politics did not require a long, slow march through the institutions. It was instantaneous. And we have to ask the question, why? Somebody said a long time ago, Marx captured Europe and Freud captured America. Well, what did that mean? What they were saying was the category of class was very operative in Europe, but the category of guilt was very operative in America. That's why Freud captured America. Well, we're no longer talking about Freud, but now we have this movement called identity politics, which captures the American guilt, which goes right back to the Puritans. We have to be very clear on this, a Christian guilt. But the Christian churches have faltered. The mainline churches have utterly collapsed since the Vietnam War. The Catholic churches have gone soft. And my argument is America is still the most religious country in the world, except it's not in the churches. Young people can find a way to establish the moral economy of transgression and guilt by going to woke identity politics. This group owes this group and this much, and you've got an intersectionality score. So I think that's why it's so powerful and it moves so quickly, is that it touched the deepest thing in the American soul, which is Christian guilt that no longer has Christianity to make sense of it. So that's why I say this is first and foremost a religious crisis.
No? Okay. Yascha, Mounk?
Does this work? All right, let me just sit here a little less formally. So I think we have to answer the question a little bit differently for the United States, and then I think there's an important question about the extent to which this will prove to be powerful outside of the United States, and particularly in Western Europe. So in the United States, it seems to me that this is going to be the big intellectual conflict of the next quarter century. The extent to which identity politics will actually govern academia, the non-profit sector, the business sector, and politics is going to be this structuring fight of the next 25 years, unless we get a war with China or some sort of huge external event that redirects the attention of the public. And broadly speaking, there are four possible outcomes. There is the total victory of wokeism or identity politics, certainly across the cultural and social sector, and perhaps less likely the political sector. There is a sort of split, which actually seems to me quite likely, where it continues to govern in an even more extreme form than it does now, academia and the non-profit sector and the fancier parts of the corporate sector. But precisely because of that, it actually leads to a series of counter-reactions against it in the political sector. So you could imagine an even more extreme form of what's basically been the case for the last 5 or 6 years, which is that the left is in control of all of the mainstream institutions, but the right is actually in control of a political apparatus and both sides hugely fear each other. And I think that there is, I'm going to end up with 3 rather than 4 categories, the possibility, I do have 4 actually. So the third is a real counter-reaction against it, where you go into something like a reactionary moment, where the great majority of Americans who doesn't like this stuff manages to mobilize and organize, but that might actually empower people like Donald Trump and his intellectual successors to take control of the society. And then there's a 4th outcome, which is the one that I hope for, which is that we are able to fight against the injustices that undoubtedly continue to exist in American society, but without giving up on the basic principles of liberal democracy, on the basic principles of philosophical liberalism, that this will somehow inspire a full-throated defense of the things that make America, and more broadly the civilizational values that we care about, work. I think that's probably the least likely outcome, but it's the one that I certainly am going to fight for, and I hope many of you will too. Now, when it comes to thinking about what the impact is going to be on Europe and on a country like France or on Germany and so on, I find myself genuinely puzzled, because there are 2 master narratives you could tell. The first is the simple formula that Western European culture is North American culture plus 5 years. And that's often true. And I see it seeping into the media in Germany and France and so on. Things that I first noticed in America 5 years ago are starting to creep up here. And a process that started slowly at the margins in the United States, then suddenly became unstoppable, along the lines of a famous motto that I went bankrupt gradually and then suddenly. That's what happened in the United States, and I could imagine it happening in Germany and France and other countries in Europe. There's another model as well, one in which, a little bit as Josh was saying, for he wasn't specifically making that claim about America, the rise of this has a lot to do with traditional American religious modes, with a Puritan culture that is particularly given to a certain kind of witch hunt, with a feeling of guilt that was traditionally animated by an explicitly religious form, but now takes this quasi-religious form. And if that's the case, that might be good news for France, because as a country that's more Catholic than you sometimes admit, you have ways of dealing with your guilt that Americans don't. And you haven't been given to quite the same forms of social witch hunts, a few revolutions here and there, that I think Tocqueville wrote about at one point. But not quite the same forms of spontaneous social cultural cleansing rituals that the United States has always had at various points in its history. And so on this question, I'm genuinely undecided. I don't know which of these master narratives to believe, or what to think if both of them are operative at some level, and you're going to see the incredibly strong cultural influence of the United States clash with the slightly less extreme cultural preconditions for something like the takeover of identity politics. I don't know what that will give you in a country like France 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, but I suppose we'll find out.
Bien. Nous arrivons donc au terme de cette table.
So we're reaching the end of our round table. As a wrap-up comment, I would say that the fever that we talked about is now affecting France's and Europe's brow. It's a sort of a pandemic. And I would finish by saying one or two words from Tocqueville. Tocqueville couldn't see what was going to happen necessarily, but it strikes me that it helps us think ahead. For Tocqueville, democracy is a conversation, and he's delighted that it is a conversation, but it's also a movement, a process that unfolds, and that is a source of inspiration for him, but a religious inspiration. There's a political democracy for discussion among citizens, in a word, but there's also a historical process involved to introduce increasing equality, but it has to be moderated and tempered in his view. I think it's the cavaliers of this process that are now invading. They feel that they embody democracy by going and seeking always more.
In fact, they're looking for more freedom as well. And I believe this is how we should consider the importance of transgender people. These are no longer exceptions. They are at the avant-garde of a certain form of humanity which reduces the non-chosen part of one's existence and which subjects it to willingness. So that's the ultimate form of freedom. But yes, indeed, when we have the horsemen of the process who are at the front of the stage, where there is no room for conversation, there is no room for dialogue. All that is left are human beings with full rights, and then living scandals on the other side. And living scandals need to be cancelled. They need to be cancelled out. And that is the reality which demonstrates the totalitarian potentials of democracy in itself, if it no longer considers itself as a process. These are my final words. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a wonderful meal. Bon appétit, as they say here in France. The interpreter apologizes, but we cannot hear what is being said. We are in our airtight booths. Apologies for not being able to interpret what's being said. Again, off-common mics cannot be heard by the interpreters. Can we please ask Mr. Finkielkraut to turn on his microphone? That was very cavalier of me, said Mr. Finkielkraut. Interpreter did not hear the beginning of his sentence, unfortunately.
My name is Martin Sommer. I come from Holland. I think I have a very complicated question, and you want to eat, so I'll put it and then we'll see. But to what extent we have also a very difficult climate discussion, and which is also very influential politically seen. To what extent does it look like this woke discussion or makes even part of it?
J'ai pas bien compris. Go ahead.
I guess the floor is yours to answer that question, since it was raised in English.
I'm not sure what your position is on this, but I'll give you mine. Excuse me. My preamble is to say that I own a sailboat and have spent a lot of money on converting it to solar electric. So I believe in advanced technologies. I'm not a Luddite. But my concern is the following. The climate change argument, the climate argument, looks to me very much like what's happening with what we're now calling wokeism or identity politics. The desperate search for cleanliness, the desperate search to purge and to scapegoat anything that is impure is to me not scientific, it's religious. And so the very language that we're using to move to a whole new technological regime is to me very fraught with religion. So we have dirty fossil fuels and clean green energy. Well, I would strongly suggest you go look at how these clean solar panels are made, because we're strip mining China for rare earth minerals. And so you're going to dig under the earth and pull out liquids, or you're going to dig on the surface of the earth and you're going to pull out different kinds of solids. It's all dirty. To be a human being is to live amidst filth, I'm sorry to say. And the problem is we need to long for more than living with filth, to be sure, but we have to understand that the world is always a broken place. I'll end with a parable. The parable of the wheat and the tares. The the sower, the servant comes to the master and says, "Master, I've gone to the fields, and I've noticed that there are weeds growing up amidst the wheat. Shall I go pull them up?" And the master says, "No, leave them there, let them grow together, because if we pull up the bad weeds, we'll also pull up the good wheat. Leave them until the end when there is the harvest, and they will be separated then." Now, what's that telling us? What it's telling us is the world is always intermixed. We're never going to have a pure world. And this means our nations are not pure, and to the conservatives who are here saying, "No, my nation is pure," I tell you, you're wrong. None of our nations are pure, but there are nations. And we have to be able to live longing for a world that's completed, but recognizing that we can't have it now. And I think what identity politics tries to do is to say, no, we can get there. We can get to purity now. We have to purge the white heterosexual male who brought you Westphalia, the nation state, who brought you capitalism, who brought you dirty fossil fuels, who brought you the heteronormative family, who brought you the homophobic church. If we can purge all those things, then we can get to purity. And my suggestion is we don't live in that sort of world. We're not going to solve our social problems by purging one group and then the next group. The only way we're going to do this is the way Tocqueville suggested, is that we build a world of competence in the mediating institutions that we have and move day to day to be stewards of the earth. And again, I'm not against climate change. I'm just terribly troubled by the religious language that is used to justify a complete change in our technological regime.
Perhaps we'll have another question. I'd like to ask a question. No, may I ask a question? Yes? I was going to say something, but go ahead, go ahead. No. It'd be better if I just shut up. I'll just shut up. But I just want to say that what's woke is Greta Thunberg, and I just wanted to mention that there's a distinction between mitigating climate change. I would like to know whether, in a certain form, the comparison, or rather going from a theological model, American political theological model, to what might be described as a political theological model for all of Europe, do you not think that that transition is a bit too simplistic? Whether it's in France or in Germany, well, we have a different connection to religion and to theological and political matters. And I'm not sure in terms of our connection that here in France we have, the categories of purity and transgression may be applicable in the French context and in perhaps more broadly the European context. Joshua Mitchell may perhaps answer, but I believe that you're absolutely right. Different categories are applicable here in France and in Europe. Nonetheless, wokeism has crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and today there's some strange inspiration that is now detectable in Europe about trying to get rid of Europe itself. One of the latest initiatives that comes to mind is trying to accuse Beethoven as being an emblem of classicism, of sexism, and even of European racism. So European guilt is perhaps linked to colonialism and to the Shoah. Yes, that is, but in the name of this guilt, we are rejecting from European culture itself. And that is what the Nazis attempted to do. And that's what's so paradoxical. But that's what we need to refer to, rather than referring perhaps to a theology of guilt and redemption. Here in Europe, we have that dark part of European history, which is which haunts the minds, and which is very poorly understood. I don't know if you wanted to add something, Josh.
I have no great faith that what I'm suggesting is going to happen. What I'm suggesting is that we are in a crisis of the sort that I think Nietzsche roughly understood, which is that there would be a time in Western Europe or in the West where these religious categories would remain, these categories that are artifacts of Christianity, but you would not have the mechanism in place anymore to correct them or to understand them fully. And so I'll say this now for a third time. We have two choices. We can have the politics of competence, or we can have the politics of innocence and transgression. And if we have the politics of innocence and transgression, there is only one way to go, and that is erasing Western civilization. That's the only way we can go. Now, I haven't said this, but I'll remind you of this. Tocqueville called himself a liberal of a new kind. And Tocqueville himself lost his faith. A very fine Tocqueville scholar named Peter Lawler said Tocqueville didn't believe in God, but he worried about what God thought of that. Think about that. But what he worried about was that Christianity had aligned itself with the aristocratic order. The democratic order had come about. You needed to have some sort of religion in order to undergird democracy. Now, the crisis that we're talking about is, and this is in a way to Yascha's point, because I agree with him, we want to go to a liberal regime, or a liberal order. The crisis that we're facing is that everything that is liberal now, it can be rooted in whiteness. And so how do you defend that? Free speech is a white thing. Science is a white thing. I mean, if you go that far, it is all over. And what I'm trying to tell you here is that you cannot respond to theological categories without theology. And if you don't, you're done. I grew up in the Middle East. My father was State Department. I came to America when I was about 7 years old, but it had already been well formed, and I realized there's an ambience, there's an Islamic ambience in the Middle East, and there's a Christian ambience in the West. And Islamic problems, as we well know, they're not going to be solved by us airdropping democracy into Afghanistan and Iraq. These are worlds unto themselves, and we are still living in this world, even if we think we've left it behind. We're living in a world which still uses these categories, and the proof of this is that everyone in this room feels guilt. That's the proof. And the question I have for you, it's Nietzsche's question. Are you going to figure out the deeper dimensions of that transgression and innocence, or are you going to continue to pretend that that's going to just go away? And yes, we're going to defend free speech and all that, but we are impotent to do that because all the things we're defending can be accused of being part of whiteness, part of the transgressive category. Yascha, you have differences, please.
Yeah, I think this is an important point of disagreement. I agree with much of what you've said, but I think there is a very important disagreement about what the right course of action is. And for two reasons. The first is that I think it is illusory to think that we are going to be able to find a common religious grounding for the values of liberal democracy. That is unrealistic in the United States, which is now secularizing at a very rapid pace, which has a great variety of different religious traditions, including non-Christian ones that are on the rise in terms of its population. And so the idea that we can somehow say, well, the way to defend traditional American values against the rise of wokeism is for all of us to sort of dig deeper into the religious foundations of this and somehow have a common religious foundation of the values we've had for a long time. I think both does violence to the nature of the American founding, but it's also not realistic as a vision for how we're going to defend this. And the second, more optimistic reason why I disagree with you is that, yes, the claim of the woke is that the only people who care about due process, the only people who care about free speech, the only people who care about liberal democracy are white, because these are all white concepts. But if you actually look at opinion polls in the United States, if you actually talk to the average American, not just the average white American, but the average, as the phrase today goes, black and brown American, that turns out to be deeply untrue. Non-white Americans are deeply patriotic. They believe deeply in the American Constitution, even though they have understandable criticisms of the extent to which the country has historically and even today lived up to those values. And they're absolutely willing to defend many of those values, particularly not in the abstract, but when they see them being violated in practice, in their own cities, in their own communities, and so on and so forth. So on this, I have to say I'm more optimistic. I think we can build multi-ethnic liberal democracies in which we convince our fellow citizens to care about those values, and not just our white fellow citizens, but our fellow citizens from wherever in the world they may originate.
Thank you. That gives us some hope. Are there any questions before we move on to lunch? One last question. What's going on?
It's actually quite short. So, one, I think there's been a great forgetting about the dangers of religious wars, of how they tear apart families and societies and bring out tremendous ruin. We've forgotten what happened at the time of the Reformation in Europe. And we've not read with the kind of vividness and clarity of how completely destructive that time period was in our shared history. And you end up with political philosophies like those of Hobbes, which thinks that virtue and individualism is not even possible anymore. What you need is a very strong state. Because as Polybius tells us, what always comes after war is anarchy, and what always comes after anarchy is dictatorship. Always. So I think the woke don't necessarily know what matches they're playing with. The question is, can there be a modern day, Josh and others, can there be a modern day Edict of Nantes, where there's an edict of toleration between those who have this religious concept of purity and those who do not? And is it possible to have a modern day Edict of Nantes when the woke are in power themselves?
May I? So I want to be clear the level at which I'm operating. With Yascha, I'm a pluralist. I'm a liberal pluralist. And so I have no interest in having some state-sponsored religion that we all adhere to. What I'm giving you is my agonizing reflections on the psychological depth of the problem. And so I'm more concerned with what's going on inside your head and my head. And what I'm troubled by is, again, what Nietzsche said, which is Europe, the West, was going to go through this phase where all the Christian accoutrements were around, but not the Christian architecture. And what I'm seeing is that all the guilt and the search for innocence, the search for purity is there, but there's no longer a religious way to do it. And that's why wokeism is so powerful. And to Yascha, I would say we're not living in a secular age. If this doesn't prove we're not living in a secular age, I don't know what does. Secular people aren't concerned with innocence and transgression. We're living in a religious moment without God. I call it a great awakening without God and without forgiveness. I mean, this is the most religious moment we've had in a very, very long time. But religion can take different forms than going to the church, and that's what I'm trying to suggest here, is that we're all searching for purity. That's what I talked about when I was talking about Black Lives Matter signs in everybody's front yard. Everybody is signaling that social death should not come cancel them. And they're doing this, corporations and everybody else, by indicating the proper social justice causes. And I should be very clear, I work with Bob Woodson. Race is a huge question. So when I'm critical of Black Lives Matter signs in the front yard, it's not because I don't think race is a big issue in America. It's a huge issue in America. I'm concerned that it's impotent to simply put signs in your front yard and say, I'm innocent, don't come to me, don't cancel me. We have real problems in our world. And this innocent signaling stuff of woke culture is a terrible way to do it, because I think the problem of guilt runs deeper than any sort of political arrangement that woke politics presents. It's ultimately a theological crisis. And so I'm not saying we need to have a state that has religion. I'm nowhere near there. I'm talking about where you and I are in our hearts on this matter of guilt and innocence, because we're haunted by it and we have no way to deal with it.
One last question, perhaps?
A quick question for Josh. Just, I wanted to push back a little bit on the idea of the identity politics happened suddenly and wasn't a long march through the institutions, because I think it in America was marching undetected for quite some time, and then I think a variety of things coincided at the same time in the culture to make it kind of break through. But critical race theory has been around for so long. I wanted maybe just clarification of what you meant by it happened suddenly or instantaneously.
So it's been brewing in the academic world for some time, to be sure. But it's really been only in the last few years, and maybe Yascha's right, it happened when Trump appeared, I don't know. But it seems to me that corporations and persons have been increasingly desperate to show that they're not worthy of social cancellation, that they're among the innocents. so it's, I think in only the last few years that you've got this sort of penetration and self-consciousness within the universities. I mean, I teach at Georgetown. Every single email in the last 2 years, every single email in the last 2 years has been about some sort of woke commitment to social justice. Nothing more about Shakespeare, nothing more about anything. This is deeply troubling. So I think it may have burned there like a forest fire underground, the burning roots for a long time, but I think it's suddenly popped up. Look, the categories of innocence and transgression are Christian categories. In that sense, they've been around for biblical categories for 3,000 years. I'm just saying we don't have a really good way to deal with it. Precisely, last thing, precisely at the moment when the wound of slavery suddenly appears to American public consciousness because of the TV coverage of what's happening in the South, precisely at the moment when colonialism is disbanded, precisely at the moments when after World War II, when people are feeling this profound guilt, precisely at that moment, the churches can't step up. I mean, that's the crisis. It's a crisis of guilt.
Je voudrais ajouter un mot.
And I want to add something, if possible. A few decades ago, Guinness de Souza had published a book titled The End of Racism. He didn't mean there that racism didn't exist anymore. He was not an idiot. He was just saying that racism was an ideology that was totally disqualified in America as anywhere else. Now, it's since the end of racism that racism has been denounced with a vigor that we know in the world. Systemic racism is very important because what is aimed by woke people now is racism from anti-racists. Anti-racists do not even know how much racist they are, and Robin DiAngelo should re-educate and be paid for it. And this is exactly what's happening. So racism itself is elected as a race. You cannot escape it when you're white. When you think you're escaping it, you're even more racist. So all sorts of topping each other, particularly in the New York Times, black with a capital letter, white with a small W. Same thing in Europe. We could say the same thing with sexism. Sexist behavior have not disappeared, violence either. Nevertheless, the revolution, feminist revolution, did happen. Equality was reached. It's absolutely clear. And it's since this very moment that a certain feminism is denouncing a domination that is omnipresent. Omnipresent in that carrying the house is suggesting courses of re-education at Robin DiAngelo to all the editors for progressist newspaper, Télérama, Le Monde, or other publication, the Observer. So in wokeism, there's something very surprising. You are awakened to discrimination that don't even happen anymore. That's all I had to say. Is that finished now?